I believe that to have interfered as I have done in behalf of his despised poor was not wrong, but right.
Night fell slowly over the Kansas frontier. By midnight on May 24th, 1856, the prairie was quiet, except for the sound of hooves moving through wet grass along the banks of Pottawatomie Creek. 5 men were riding with John Brown. They carried rifles, but the work they came to do would be done with swords. Before sunrise, 5 pro-slavery settlers would be dragged from their homes and killed in the dark. Their bodies would be left beside the road. The event would become known as the Pottawatomie Massacre. And in that moment, long before the first cannon fired in the American Civil War, Americans were already killing each other over slavery. But the deeper question remained. How did a remote frontier territory become the first battlefield of a war that had not yet begun? Three days earlier, another kind of violence had erupted. On May 21st, 1856, a pro-slavery force of nearly 800 men rode into the Free State town of Lawrence, Kansas. They smashed printing presses. They burned the Free State Hotel. They looted homes and businesses while territorial authorities stood aside. The attack would become known as the Sack of Lawrence. But the destruction of the town was not random frontier lawlessness. It was the result of a political experiment already collapsing. 2 years earlier, Congress had passed the Nebraska Act. The law did something explosive. Instead of banning slavery in the Western territories, it declared that settlers themselves would vote to decide. The concept was called popular sovereignty. In theory, it was democratic. In practice, it turned Kansas into a battlefield. Within months, armed settlers flooded the territory from both sides of the slavery question. From the north came Free State settlers. From Missouri came pro-slavery bands, soon known as border ruffians. And when Kansas held its first territorial elections in 1855, thousands crossed the border with guns. Ballot boxes were seized. Polling places were occupied. Fraudulent votes outnumbered legal settlers. A pro-slavery legislature was declared the winner. Free State settlers refused to recognize it. Suddenly, Kansas had 2 rival governments. One backed by Washington, one backed by rifles. And as one rising political voice would later argue, this was never a lawful system to begin with. Abraham Lincoln described it bluntly.
I look upon that enactment not as a law, but as violence from the beginning. It was conceived in violence, passed in violence, is maintained in violence, and is being executed in violence.
Then in May 1856, violence erupted inside the United States Senate itself. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner delivered a speech condemning pro-slavery forces. 2 days later, Preston Brooks walked into the chamber carrying a cane. He beat Sumner unconscious at his desk. Across the country, the reaction split the nation. In the North, Sumner became a martyr. In the South, Brooks received canes engraved with the words, "Hit him again." The message was unmistakable. Politics was breaking down. Violence was replacing it. And in Kansas, men like John Brown were watching. Brown had arrived in the territory in 1855, convinced that slavery would only be destroyed by force. The sack of Lawrence convinced him the war had already begun. Later, He would justify what came next in simple terms.
Something must be done to show these barbarians that we too have rights.
So on the night of May 24th, 1856, Brown and his followers rode toward Pottawatomie Creek. They had a list. One by one, they knocked on cabin doors. 5 men were taken from their homes. None were slave owners, but all were considered supporters of the pro-slavery cause. Before dawn, each was killed with broadswords in the darkness. The news spread through Kansas like wildfire. For pro-slavery settlers, the killings proved abolitionists were terrorists. For Free State supporters, Brown had finally struck back. Either way, something irreversible had happened.
Kansas erupted into open guerrilla war. Cabins were burned. Ambushes became common. Settlers slept with rifles beside their beds. As one observer wrote at the time, the violence was no longer isolated. It was spreading. Kansas bleeding.
When Kansas bleeds, Georgia must open her veins, and Massachusetts.
Over the next 3 years, dozens would die in scattered attacks. Historians would later call it Bleeding Kansas. But the violence in the territory was doing something even more dangerous. It was reshaping national politics. A new party emerged, the Republican Party, built on opposition to slavery's expansion. At the same time, Southern leaders began to argue that coexistence was no longer possible. Kansas had become more than a territory. It had become a warning. And at the center of that warning was John Brown. 3 years later, he would lead a raid on a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His goal, a slave uprising. The raid failed. He was captured, tried, and sentenced to death. But before his execution, he left one final warning.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood.
Within 16 months, the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The Civil War had begun. But the first blood had already been spilled in the fields of Kansas. But one question still lingers. Was Bleeding Kansas an isolated frontier conflict? Or was it the moment the United States quietly crossed the line into civil war, long before the nation realized it?
Massachusetts, too.
I am a girl, but I can fire a pistol. And if ever the time comes, I will send some of you to the place where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth.